pleasure that this week I'm going to be interviewing the famous Niel Bushnell. And he's going to get even more famous because I'm one of the lucky people who have been allowed to read this fantastic book, Arkship Obsidian. Advanced reader copy, so you can't quite read this all yet unless you sign up to his newsletter and do that. So, first and foremost, Niel, I want to thank you for writing such a great book. As a new reader to your work, it completely swept me along, and it reminded me of that lovely feeling of discovering a great new sci-fi series. So thank you, first and foremost.
Thank you. It's really kind.
Now, one thing that became very obvious to me as I started to read your book is that you obviously have a love of classic sci-fi. Now, that's something I'm no stranger to myself. Especially having grown up during what many consider to be a golden age of science fiction. So I'm really keen to explore your key influences with you and your own writing. So here comes the first question. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
My first question to you is, what are your favourite science fiction books? But this is a trick question because there's also a bonus question here as well. And the follow through is, how do you feel that's influenced your own writing with Arkship Obsidian?
Okay, well, I'd say my favourite science fiction writers are people like Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Douglas Adams as well, on the more kind of comedy end of science fiction. But certainly with this book, the influences were strong in my head at the time of writing, were Asimov's Foundation series. And I read that when I think I was probably about 15 or 16 when I read the first book, and then got all the others in the series after that. And I really love the way that he builds up a world and then expands it and draws you into the characters and introduces new characters, takes you to different time periods within that world, and is constantly churning up really good, clever ideas within that world. So that was definitely in the forefront of my mind. And I always love reading Arthur C. Clarke. He's always my go-to. When I go on holiday, I always take an Arthur C. Clarke book with me. And he's somebody that I just keep coming back to and keep dipping into. So I was thinking of those two writers specifically when I started to write this. But I do kind of try and think in a cinematic way as well. So I think that the combination of those kind of classic science fiction influences and thinking in a slightly more cinematic way than maybe they were thinking is how I approached the writing of the first book, Arkship Obsidian.
Fantastic answer. I think with all those writers, that generation, the sort of writing they were doing was so visionary and so expansive. I think particularly true of the Foundation series, where it's truly epic in scale of what the ideas going on, and I think that's I've read the one book, and I want to talk about how many you're sort of planning in a moment, but I can already see that you've set the stage for some very sort of epic ideas of your own with Arkship Obsidian. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how you expand your universe, and as all the players sort of come in and all the layers and all the rest of it. But wonderful. So next question then, which is obviously, how many books do you think you're planning to write in this fantastic series?
Well, my initial thoughts are 6, but they get more and more vague in my notes the further forward I get. So I've got a rough idea of the main character in the first book is a character called Wynne, who when we first meet him, he knows as much about himself as we do. He's escaped from the Arkship Obsidian as it's being attacked, and he has no memory of his life before that moment. So he's woken up in this escape pod, has no clue who he is, where he's going, what's happened before. So these 6 books are intended as a chronicle of his life, really, and the arc that he will go on from where we first meet him in this escape pod to his ultimate conclusion. But beyond that, hopefully, if it's successful, I've got ideas for other standalone stories and collections, a series of books within the same world. So I initially had this idea a few years ago about this. The premise behind it is that we're in some unmentioned distant future, and the solar system has been destroyed. There's this huge event that's happened called the fracture, where the sun has been ripped apart and turned into this kind of sinuous kind of symbol that looks a bit like the symbol of infinity. It's kind of a swirling tendril that curls around on itself. So people call it the infinite. But during this destruction, it also ripped apart every planet, every solid body in the solar system. So our solar system now, and the survivors of humanity, live on these vast arkships. These are the only things that survive this destruction. So as I was starting to plot the first book, I was thinking about this world and how that had happened and why it had happened. So they're some of the areas that I'd like to explore. And then there were certain organisations that came along within the development of the story, because each of the arkships is kind of a separate family or a separate group, almost like an individual country with its own culture. So I started to think about how I could develop that and use that in different elements for different stories as well. So there's scope for lots of stories, but obviously that all depends upon me finding the readers who enjoy it.
Brilliant. I think the joy of like with the Arkship, the individual Arkships, the individual cultures you're going with there, that's a gift for a writer, because you get to like create all these like mini universes within the larger universe, all these sort of like play of characters and all the rest of it. So I think it's you've got such a play bed with that, the whole Arkship universe.
Yeah. Well, that's it. It's for me. I just feel like exactly that. It's that I've got this huge playground, and I can make up the rules to a degree. I've established this event that happened at the beginning. I've effectively wiped the solar system clean and can make up my own rules within that. But then, I'm trying to stick to those rules. So then that throws up questions about, well, how did this happen? Who survived, who didn't? What cultural elements come in?
With literally the end, the classic Big Bang, and you've done it right at the start. Yeah. I mean, where do you go from there?
Exactly. So
it's trying to imagine all of the things that we identify as our within our culture. So commerce, religion, family, and how those are reinvented in this world. So I can play with things like there's a religion that's grown up around the fracture. It's called the Church of the Infinite, and it's exploring. Part of what I want to do there is explore how these things are established, how a new religion comes into being, and then the motivations behind the people who create that, and whether their intentions are good, or whether there's an element of kind of population control or individual control within that as well. So there's lots of things that I can play with. And I touch upon some of them very gently, I think, in the first book. But yeah, there's lots of scope for me to explore further.
Yeah, you can really sense this is going to be opening out and out and out already in the sort of foundation what you've done with the Obsidian. Oh, look, foundation. My next question is actually to do with how you're publishing this book. Now, you're a very successful, traditionally published author. But the interesting thing is you've taken the decision to self-publish Arkship Obsidian. So, why? What's your thinking there?
Well, my books that have been published so far have been mainly fantasy and mainly for children and young adults. So it's a different marketplace, really. And so when it came to writing this, I felt like this was a very different audience to the one I've already established, and that might be a bit of a kind of a shock to the system, I suppose, to anyone who knows me through traditional publishing.
Yes.
So I thought, well, and also partly because this is something quite new for me as well. I've never really written anything like this, even though I've read this sort of thing for years, and everyone I've spoken to who knows me well, as soon as I have explained what the plot is, they say, "Oh, that's so you, Neil. That's exactly the kind of thing you're into." And I think, "Oh yeah, I suppose it is really." So it's interesting that I feel like it started off in a slightly self-indulgent way. So self-publishing is something I've been interested in, and I felt like it was a good fit for this because it was different to my other writing, and hopefully I'll still continue to do those kind of books as well. But this was just something I wanted to try and see where it would go. So that was the reason behind trying to do it as a self-published book.
How do you feel without the support of a traditional publisher behind you to launch this book? Is that been something of a challenge, or is it something you've readily taken to? What's that been like?
Well, it's a huge learning curve, I think, for any author moving from a traditional ecosystem into self-publishing. It's a huge shift in thinking, really. It's not just a case of, well, the writing is the same and then I'll put it out. Yes, you can do that, but you'll probably get 3 people reading your book. So it's a very different environment. So I think you have to be aware of that going in, that you're the person responsible for the cover, for the marketing, for the content, for the editing. You have to either be able to do that yourself or source the people who you're creating a new support system around you that comes with a traditional publisher. So it's a very different mindset. But what I like about it is that you can react much more quickly. So if I'm publishing a book with a traditional publisher and I get the go-ahead today that yes, a publisher loves a story that I've written, so maybe I've written a book earlier this year, the beginning of the year, I've sent it to my agent, it's gone out to publishers, they've taken a few months to consider it, it goes through their system, and they've said yes today. It would still probably be either late next year or probably realistically into 2019 before it saw the light of day. So by then, life moves on. So I really like the immediacy of this in the fact that, I wrote this book over the summer, I've edited it, and I've had an editor working on it, and it's out in the beginning of October, so 10, 12 days time. So I love the how quickly you can get something out, and the fact that you can try something, and if it doesn't work, then yes, you've lost your own time and effort in the work that you've done, but you haven't. It's not affecting the bottom line of a huge publishing company. So I quite like that. It's sort of that. It feels a bit more like kind of almost indie music, that kind of feel of doing something. But as I said, I haven't turned my back on traditional publishing. It's just this is something I want to try, and because it's a different marketplace and a different reader cross section, then it feels like the right thing to do.
I think for our sort of readers, they're probably not aware sometimes of how the bigger gap can be between us writing the book and it actually getting into their hands. And I had one book and it was about 18 months after I finished it, it finally got out there. But the problem about there is really one of sustaining the energy, because what the lovely thing about what you're doing here is that immediacy of you create the work, you're on to the next one. I suspect you're probably interacting with your audience as well through your ARC readers.
That's true. Yeah.
And a feedback system that you are feeding off almost in real time. That's going to be wonderful. That must be oxygen.
Well, yeah, that's a really good point, because you with a traditional publisher, they are there almost as a buffer really between you and the reader, which can be useful because you get all that support. But you're right, I've had far more contact with readers now on this book, even before it's come out, than I have probably on the other children's books that I've done. Unless I do a lot of events where I go into schools and libraries, and you get that immediate contact then. But that's well after the book's finished, and you've probably written the second book, and it's a bit like an ocean liner, and it's hard to turn it at that point. Whereas with this, you're much more lean and kind of reactive, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, if this was a traditional setup, if the book was coming out now, then the second one might be a year's time, and then the third one a year after that. Whereas with this, I'm hoping that the second book is out before Christmas, and the third book is out before the spring next year. So there's a much faster turnaround, which means you've got to write fast, but actually having written quickly and slowly, I've tried. My first few books were written over quite a long period of time. I actually think I'm a better writer when I write quicker, because it's in your head. Yeah, it's sort of in your head, and you it doesn't get a chance to sort of fade away, and then you have to go back and revisit it. There's an urgency and an immediacy to the writing, I think, that only comes about by writing a book over 2 months.
Rather than writing a novel for a year.
How short a time? 2 months? Good grief.
This one was about 2 months.
Months, yeah, it's ridiculous, I know, but it's a bit like, if you'd said that to me a few years ago, I wouldn't have thought that was possible for me. But I think it's a bit like training for a marathon. I did the Great North Run a few years ago, and I couldn't. When I first started training, I couldn't run at all, and I did about 10 minutes and had to go.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and gradually I
built up, and I think it's the same with my writing, in that you start off and you write, in the pace that feels right for you. But then I think it's almost realizing that yes, you can do more, you can write more quickly, and it doesn't necessarily have to affect the quality of the writing. In fact, I think for me, I think it makes it a better, more solid story. I don't tend to meander quite so much, I think, if I'm writing in a more rapid sense.
Very interesting. That chimes with some of my own experience, but that's for another discussion, because this is about you, not me. Now, great story, but also, Neil, you have, I'll just get that back up, a great cover. And obviously, apart from a great blurb, a great cover is one of the key things to draw that sort of first contact with one's book. So I believe you produced this. So now I know a little bit about you, and I do know that you used to work in the special effects industry, and it certainly shows in the quality of what you produce there. So how do you go from taking that initial sort of spark of an idea for a cover into producing that, into turning it into such a fantastic cover? What's your process?
Well, my background, as well as writing, is I've worked as an animator for 20 plus years, working in film and television, and so I've learned the techniques of. I started off in 2D, sort of what you'd call traditional pencil and paper animation, and I've moved over to digital 3D CGI animation. And I still work in that area as well. But yeah, it's something that I've always enjoyed doing, is building models, preferably spaceships, and lighting them, rendering them, animating them, blowing them up.
It's always been something that I've enjoyed doing.
Hang on, this is all the stuff that we did when we were kids. We sort of like built models and set fire to them.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly that, yeah. But I've been lucky enough to be paid to do that as well, which is quite nice. So I've worked on a couple of science fiction TV series and built spaceships and blown them up and things like that. So that's great fun. It's perfect for me. So one of the things that I wanted to try when I came to writing this was to build the models myself and create the book cover and see if I could create something that reflected the images that were in my head when I was writing it. So yeah, I started building the models, putting them together, and trying to work out how that would look and how that would work, rather than sort of getting in stock models and playing with them. I've kind of created it all from scratch. So hopefully it has a look that is similar enough to other books that people understand what they're getting, but has its own look, hopefully. And part of that was I researched the marketplace, I suppose, for want of a better term, but looked at what other books were out there and what the covers were like for those and how they compared to what I had in mind. So I think that's all gone into the design work.
Fantastic. I mean, it's a lovely piece of work, and I think it's already ticking all the right boxes for your potential audience. So beautifully done. I'll doff my hat to you if I was wearing one. So, in terms of writing your books, how long does it take you to write a book? Oh no, you told me this, didn't you? 2 months.
Well, it's not a hard and fast answer, to be honest. I mean, yeah, this one took about 2 months. I think I started it in July sometime. But it's been an evolution for me. So the first book I ever wrote took about 3 months. But then it took about another year to rewrite it.
Oh yes, I know that one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
the whole process was about a year. Then the second one was similar, and since then I've been just trying to get it down and be a bit more focused about what I'm doing. Maybe plan a bit more than I used to. So yeah, it's a learning curve. I think there's no hard and fast answer. You know, if you asked me to write a book today, I couldn't tell you that it would be ready in, you know, a set period of time. But I feel like I'm getting better at it.
I was just saying I think it's fantastic those moments when a character enters stage left that you had no idea, and I think that's the joy, the alchemy of writing, and those wonderful moments when it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, absolutely, and they surprise you as well. It sounds quite cheesy, I think, when you hear that from a writer, but when a character does something unexpected. This particular character started off as a name, and then I just thought about, well, what does she look like? And then that became a jumping off point, and I thought, oh, okay, so she's quite manipulative, she's quite she's a planner, she's ambitious, and then it was like, okay, well, where does that ambition take her? And then when I started to think about where, from the starting point to where she wanted to go, that suddenly had a huge effect on another main character, which is one of the main things that I'm going to explore in book 2.
Oh, nice little ones. I like glimpses of the future there. So, talk about the future. Now let's look into the crystal ball, Neil. What does future literary success look like for you?
Well, I think there's a lot riding on me making a success of book 1, and my hope for the future is that when book 1 comes out, October the 5th, it's due out, is that it finds its audience, and that the audience enjoys the book enough and likes what I'm doing with it to want to jump on and carry on into book 2 and 3 and hopefully beyond that. So the future for me is that I find that audience, they enjoy the writing and are enthusiastic enough to carry on buying, and I'd love to write more of these sorts of stories, explore this world further. I'd love it if they became audiobooks as well. They're coming out as a Kindle and as a print book, but yeah, I just love to be able to have the readership that would allow me to grow this world and find out what's over there and what's hiding in that direction.
I think it's that promised land of having an audience that gets our madness and why we do what we do.
Yeah, that would be exactly it.
Exactly that. And I know they're out there. I know there are people like you and like me who love those kinds of stories, and hopefully there's enough of them that enjoy it and find it. That will mean that I can justify spending more time and writing more stories.
Absolutely, and I'm sure you will with this series. Now this is an interesting question. What is your writing kryptonite?
Oh, my writing kryptonite, I suppose. Well, it's other things, isn't it? You know, I love to watch TV, I love to watch films, I love to read books, I love to get outside and go for a walk and get on my bike and things like that. So they're all things that you know, real life stops me writing sometimes, but they also feed into the writing as well. So today, as we speak, Star Trek Discovery.
Yes.
Yeah, so tonight is watching the first 2 episodes of that, so that's going to be great. I've been looking forward to that, and that's something I'm sure I'll be picking a few ideas from as well along the way. But yeah, I suppose those are the kind of things that stop me writing. Lack of confidence sometimes is something that can stop me completing something, but I'm trying more and more, and actually that's another thing about writing quickly that stops you from stopping yourself, I suppose. I read Stephen King's book on writing years ago, and he talks about how he always feels like the sort of the black dog of writing is only a couple of days behind, and he's chasing you down constantly. So that if you stop and you take a few days off and then think about your writing again and go back to it, you are filled with those self-doubts. They've caught up with you, and you have to go back and edit chapter 1 again, and then rewrite chapter 2, and then delete chapter 3, and you end up in this kind of loop of rewriting and doubting yourself. Whereas if I do write quickly, I do find that I keep ahead of those doubts, and hopefully, you know, the lack of confidence and those doubts don't catch me up until I'm far enough into the writing process that you can't stop me then. You know, you'll know yourself, it's those first few chapters sometimes, or the first half of the book, where you think, this isn't working, why am I doing this? But once you get over that and you start to feel the flow of the book and understand the shape of it, then you can take the foot off the gas a little bit. But yeah, I suppose if I have a kryptonite, that.
I think the momentum's really important there. It's the temptation to fiddle, especially with the first draft. You can slow up because a bit's not working, and the thing you learn as you get more experience is to actually carry on and grit your teeth and ignore it. Don't look at it too much in the rearview mirror. Get to the end and then come back, and it will be easier. But I don't know if this is true for you, but often I find that sometimes the pieces of writing I struggle most with, and I think they're just rubbish, and I've been banging my head against the wall, they're often my best bits of writing. They never feel like it at the time, but I've really struggled. But sometimes it's not what you're not doing what you think you are. I suppose that's my point.
Yeah, that's true. You end up, I think sometimes you struggle and pause because it's out of your comfort zone, or it's something that's difficult. So you slow down. So there's a huge battle. I won't spoil it too much, but there's a huge battle at one point in Arkship Obsidian. And I know, shock and surprise, the cover kind of gives that away slightly, doesn't it? But and I knew what I wanted to do with it. I knew where it was going and where all the pieces would be at the end. But part of me was really doubtful about how my ability to be able to describe a huge battle. And it was a case of me sitting down going, no, come on, Neil, you can do this. You have to do this. And then once I started it, I kind of got into it, and it was okay. But it's interesting what stops you.
I'm not talking my own work here, but I went through exactly the same thing with a battle sequence in the final book of Cloud Riders, which literally goes on for half the book.
Oh, right.
So, and I had exactly the same misgivings approach. I thought, how am I going to write this epic battle sequence, which goes on and is layered and all the rest of it? But it came together. So yes, that really, I know where you're coming from. So, what piece of advice would you give to a new writer that you wish someone had given to you at the start of your own writing career?
I suppose there's a part of me wished I'd started sooner. So I started, I've written on and off all of my life since I was, I grew up loving comics. I still love comics, but I grew up drawing and writing comics. So that's where I first started to learn how to tell a story. But I didn't start novel writing till I was in my 30s, really. Late 30s, actually. And part of me wishes I'd started sooner. But I think as a general piece of advice, I think it comes back to that feeling of having the right to write. That it's something that you can do. I'm from a town in the northeast. I'm not from a privileged background, and part of me when I first started writing was feeling that this wasn't something that people like me do. And I know now that's completely ridiculous. I've met lots and lots of writers from lots of different backgrounds, but at the time that was something I had never met another writer. And I thought, well, this is why on earth should I have the gall and presumption to think I can do this? But I think anybody can write, and it's about having the determination and the perseverance to keep going. And writing is a long game. You've got to persevere. It might not be the first book or the third book or the fifth book that gets you where you want to be, but if you really want to do it and enjoy it, you've just got to keep going.
Absolutely, that's brilliant advice. I think it's hanging in there, it's perseverance, it's about self-belief as well.
Clinging on.
Yes, yes, something I think we both know all about. So, final question then, Neil. And it's the burning question that I'm sure all your fans will be asking the moment they finish Arkship Obsidian. Although I'm sure you have answered this, but anyway, I will answer it again. When is the next instalment coming out?
The next instalment, all being well, will be coming out on, I think it's the 14th of December. Certainly before Christmas, anyway. And the pre-order is now live on Amazon, and it's called Arkship Vengeance. And yes, we like a good bit of vengeance. And so it's all being well, it'll be coming out in December.
Fantastic. Now, I have no doubt that you're going to have huge success with this series, and I personally cannot wait to read Arkship Vengeance. Arkship Vengeance. Yes, right, in my brain now. Arkship Vengeance. Go and order it right now, everybody. What are you waiting for? Neil, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I can't wait to read the next book. Till the next time, take care.
Thanks very much. Take care.